Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we will continue looking into our for statement in Java, and we will start exploring the individual substatements that belong to the for statement. Now, first thing first, now that we have this countdown method, let's actually test it, encapsulate it, and we will not generalize at this stage, but please feel free to go ahead and do it. We'll just go ahead and create a new method, public static void, and we're going to call it countdown. We're going to take this logic, all of it, encapsulate it inside our method, and then Control-Shift-F will put things in a formatted way for us. We'll take care of the extra spacing and add spacing as necessary. Now, going back to our main method, we said we have a for statement. It has 3 individual statements inside. One was an initializer statement. We said here we initialize a variable and add value to it, right? Then we looked at conditional statement is less than 10, for an example, and then we looked at update statement. We'll get to them later, but in this part of this video, let's look at this initializer block. Major comments. Initializer statement runs only once before the loop starts. Obviously, it initializes value. I'm not going to put it in there. It is optional. Okay. Now, let's create a basic print statement, and we're just going to create print for the value of I. Correct? When we run this main method, which has only a single for statement inside, we have I initialized at 1. Now, we will print it since I is less than 10, and we're going to update it. When we run it, we're going to obviously get, and let's actually use a print statement instead of print line so that we see them in one row. Okay? Now, we said initializer block is optional. If I delete it, what will happen is my code will not compile, because since I'm using any kind of a value here, this value has to be initialized somewhere. It can be initialized outside. It can be initialized outside, but the value that you're going to check inside the loop has to be initialized somewhere, but it does not have to be inside the for statement. Initializing a value outside is perfectly fine. When I do it, this statement now looks very similar to while statement, right? We had a value initialized outside, we checked for a condition, then this update, which we'll look at down the road, was inside the block of the while statement. However, let's run for this. This works perfectly fine. Okay, so this is the idea of a variable of the initializer block being optional. Now, let's put this back in, and let's look at the conditional statement, the second part. Okay, now, conditional statement, add our comments. Is checked every time before an iteration. Loop is the same thing as an iteration. Every time before an iteration, we check for a condition. Right? Now, the statement, the for block, will run only if the condition is true. Is also optional. What if we say I is equal to 1? We're checking for a condition, is I greater than 10, then we're gonna run the block and we're gonna increment. This is going to run, and this is going to produce no result, because this initializer statement ran when we executed this code, but when it came to the condition, it looked at the condition that I is not greater than 10 because I is only 1, no matter I is going to increase somewhere down the road, it's going to be incremented somewhere down the road. It does not matter. Before we want to run this statement, we need to make sure this condition is true. It is also optional. If you delete it, you are going to get an infinite loop. Or actually, yes, we saw this before. You see, the loop is being run. However, we don't see any result, any output. Okay, so conditional statement is also optional. We will see how we can play with this and add additional breaks or stops inside our statement down the road. But do not forget, in a for statement, also in a while statement, condition is actually important from the point of view that this is the only stop point, this is the only checkpoint to see when this loop is going to run and when this loop is not going to run. Putting here true will make this loop infinite. And we do not see the output because it is being printed out and the compiler decides that not to show it to us, right? Simply because there is no point. This thing is being run and there is no specific outcome. This can be false. If you do so, we reach the error that says unreachable code or dead code. You see, we saw this with return statements. We saw it with the condition when we put into while. We put a condition to be false, and it was Java compiler was telling us that this block is never going to run. Why do you want to have it inside your source code? Or check out your condition because something has to be wrong, because why would you have a code that would not run? So as long as I is less than 10, we're going to keep this condition as is. Okay, now let's move on to our third part of our for statement, and this is going to be update. Okay, now update statement also known as, and this is very important, also known as part is very important, it is called post iteration statement. Now, why is we repeated that this naming of update statement is important? Simply because this happens after the block is run. We initialized our value, we checked for a condition. So we initialized our value, done and gone, forgotten, because that was done once. So I is 1. We checked for the condition. After the condition is true, we don't go to this update statement. We iterate. So we do one iteration, one execution. Then only after that one execution, we go to our update statement or post iteration statement. Okay. Now, this is important because this is the statement that will update the value of our variable that our condition checks for. So used to update, actually let's do this, runs after every iteration, used to update the value to be checked against the condition, also optional. Let's say we don't have it. Run this code. 1 is always going to be less than 10, and we got into an infinite loop. Our program is running. We can terminate it, but it is not showing anything. This is an infinite loop. Whereas when we had it, we would get printout of 1 through until 10. And if you remember, with while loops, we were getting, when we were iterating, when we were updating inside the statement, we were actually getting print out as 10 too. But in this case, we're not going to get it because this update is going to be done after the statement is run and condition is checked. Okay, now let's look into some options. Since we said all these statements are optional, we don't even need to have anything here, right? This is going to be, and we don't even need to have an I, let's say test, right? This will not complain. This is a simplest example of an infinite loop. Run this program, you're not gonna see anything, but your program is running. Compiler does not bother showing you anything because compiler says that this is an infinite loop. There is nothing to say. Your program is stuck. So this is what happens if you have an infinite loop in your program somewhere, and in the middle of execution, your program looks like it is running, your computer starts warming up, but program doesn't do anything, simply because you got stuck somewhere inside your code with an infinite loop. So always beware infinite loops. Always test for them. So let's put everything back. This is option 1. Now, option 2, you can declare as many variables inside initializer block as you want to. Okay? So in this block, you declared an integer type variable called I that has a value 1, the same type variable called n that has a value 10, the same type variable called y that has a value 4. So in Java, we have not seen this before because this is not a good practice. It is not a common practice at all. But that might be used within for statements, this is okay. String first name is equal to John, comma, last name is equal to Doe, comma, middle name, middle initial is equal to N. In this single line, we declared 3 string variables. When you want to print out for these variables, first name plus space plus middle initial plus space plus last name. When you run this program, it will run perfectly fine. It will execute John and Doe. This separating variables of the same type, declaring and assigning them on the single line is doable. This applies for any type of a variable, let it be a primitive or a non-primitive. D1 is equal to 4.2, comma, D2 is equal to 5.8, etc. Right? So the same syntax is actually used sometimes, not too often, because it's again confusing, sometimes inside initializer blocks. Because sometimes you might have to check for a condition of I, sometimes you might have to check for a condition of Y, etc., etc., and you might have to have some code executions that are related to N, Y, or else. Now, you cannot have multiple conditions, you cannot have separated conditions inside a conditional statement. However, of course, you can have complex conditions. X is greater than 2. Oh, there's no X, right? I is greater than 2, right? You can have these complex conditions. You can have flag methods here. Boolean is true is equal to 3 greater than 5. For actually, this is going to return false. So if I add this here, I believe this is going to give us a issue, or it didn't, because compiler was not is not smart enough to look into this and see that this is going to be false. So this is never going to run, right? This statement is never going to run because this true is not true. Actually, it is false. So let's put a flag. Usually flags are called positively, but we will call it is false. Okay, so you can do this as well. You can call a method in here, a flag method, as long as the statement inside is going to return a Boolean value, you are perfectly fine. Okay, this now when it comes to update operation, update operators, update statement can have multiple operations as well, as long as they are declared. It can be plus equal to 3. So this is also perfectly fine. However, not a good practice. Sometimes you take update statement and put it inside your code, inside your execution block. This is okay not a good practice. Actually, let's do this. Is false. Let's do I less than 10. When you run this, you see, so not much of a difference, exactly the same output. However, sometimes you might choose to put update statement inside the block. Now, and as we said earlier, you can have multiple update statements. So multiple initializer values, multiple update values are okay. There is one more thing I think this is going to be the last thing we will share with you at this stage is about going to be about code blocks. We're always talking about code blocks. We said this is a for block. This is a main method block. This is our countdown method block, right? Now there is one thing you need to remember about. You need to always remember about blocks. When we said you cannot, you can declare a variable outside, right? You can say int x is equal to 0. And then you can use this variable here. You can actually update the, we can't do it here, unfortunately, because you're declaring, oh, let's do this. Let's take the whole thing out. We can do x is equal to 4. And we're gonna need to remove i's and replace them with x. And we're gonna need to remove y because we just removed those values, and let's remove this. So you have a declared variable outside and assign the value 0. When you get to the loop, you can assign the value to 4. However, do not forget, when the variable is coming from outside, when it is inside the loop and when it is being updated, remember what this is equal to x plus 1, right? When it is being updated, the value of this variable is actually changing. First time it changed to 4. After this loop, it's going to change to 10, right? So let's print this variable outside. You see, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Because this 10 is coming from here. If you want to see, let's do this print line. 4 coming from inside the statement because the first time its value is 4. It is less than 10. We added 1 to it. It became 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And this 10 is coming from outside. And one more time, outside the for block. Run it. Now this is for sure. You see? So if you're doing something to a variable that is declared outside of a block, and you're doing something to it inside the statement, inside like a different block, then when you access it from outside again, that value is going to be changed. However, if you declare an int I is equal to 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus, you print out I inside. This is perfectly fine, right? You cannot print out I outside because this I variable belongs to the inner block, to this for statement. The same way as here, I have this value variable inside this countdown method. I cannot print it from outside the countdown method. However, my countdown method can take a value from outside by passing a variable, passing an argument. So unfortunately, with for statements, there is no passing in and no passing out of an argument. The way you can pass in a value is through declaration of a value of a variable outside the block. However, if you declare anything inside the block, for example, int count is equal to 10, you cannot access that variable from outside the block. These are, remember the stack memories, this is a stack memory representative. You cannot access this frame, you cannot access this block from outside. Do not forget that because that's one of the common errors as well. You try to create a variable inside like this, then you try to look for its value from outside. If you need that kind of relationship, declare this variable outside. This is perfectly fine. Int I is perfectly fine. I is equal to 0. This will work, and you can still access I from outside. If you run it, this will work just perfectly fine. See, so declared outside, initialize it, update it inside, and then you can access it outside. Anything declared inside, stay inside. Whatever happens inside the for block stays inside the for block. Okay, so we covered most of the features of a for loops. Now, of course, do experiment. There might be something that we have not looked into. Do experiment and do try out options. See what happens if you change the values even further. See what kind of surprises you get. Do experiment and do learn from your mistakes. Thank you very much for your time. And in the next video, we will look into we'll try to compare while and for loops together, and we'll try to understand where would be the best usages for both. Thank you. I will see you then.